Okay, we're getting a slightly late start, and part of the reason for that are some tech issues. So, what I'm going to do is not play any music because then YouTube will ban us all. But what I'm going to do is, if you'll just bear with me a moment here, we're going to get all these tech issues running properly, and then we will pick up where we left off. So, last Wednesday, we had this awesome meeting. What are we going to do with this open Wednesday time slot? And lots of different ideas. We could do the Nietzsche thing again. We can do the Backbone Year 3 course on Nietzsche, decoding Zarathustra. Wow, that'd be fun. We didn't record it last time. Lots of ideas. However, what we settled on was starting part of the literature curriculum. There are 5 sections in the literature curriculum. In the middle are things that we're calling culturally foundational or epics or something like that, right? So there's like mythopoetry. It's like Ovid's Metamorphoses and Genesis and things like that. Then there is mysticism. Then there's things that it's about the heroes instead of the gods or something like that, right? So um, we're going to look at works in this category that include what's I think foundational is probably a better word, but culturally uh, highly significant works. And what we're doing is we're reading the Thousand and One Nights. So we're not only reading the Thousand and One Nights, but we're reading other works of literature that make allusions to it or are inspired by it. Okay, let's see. I say yes, I'll accept all your terms. Yes, I'll accept everything. Oh, Lord, help me if I can remember any of this. All the passwords that might exist. We're going to get a better translation at some point, and we're also going to get there was a problem. Forgot your password. Of course you did. All right, let's try this. Two-step verification. Wonderful. Okay. Sign in. Oh my goodness, we managed to get it done. Okay. So we're reading two works at the same time now. And last time we talked a lot about the stories within stories of the Thousand and One Nights and the story of the storyteller. Please tell me I have this book on Kindle now that I've downloaded everything. Oh, come on. I know I have this here. Oh, you bastages. No, no. Oh, that was my best hope. I don't know how I've lost this book. I've had multiple copies of this other book, and I don't know how I lost it. So we might not be continuing today with the other book that we're reading at the same time. Last time we read the first chapter of 2 Years, 8 Months, and 28 Nights, Salman Rushdie's, one of his 6 masterpieces, which, of course, the title adds up to 1,000 Nights and One Night More. And the main character is a Jinnia, a member of the female tribe of the Jinn, of the genies, and or the Jinira, and she has the name Duniyazad or Dunia, and that's of course Scheherazad's sister in the Thousand and One Nights. And yep, it's definitely not in here. Okay, that's a bummer, but we'll find what happened to that book at some point, and maybe we will today before we're done. But let's get back into the Thousand and One Nights. So we talked about the story of the storyteller keeping herself alive by telling such interesting stories to civilize the madman that is her husband, who was once a great king, but who's been struggling with some realities that he doesn't know how to cope with properly. And also the relationship between her and her sister, saying, "Look, I'm going to go marry this murderous king so that he'll stop marrying other women in the kingdom and then killing them the next day. I just need you to come in 2:30 in the morning. I'll ask the king if I can see my dear sister, knowing that I have to die the next day. And when you come in at the appropriate time, just turn to me and say, 'Would you please help us to pass the midnight hours with some of your excellent stories?'" And then she starts telling stories that are so fascinating and so interesting that the king decides he has to let her live one more day so that she can continue the story where it left off. And through the course of 1,001 nights of keeping herself alive like that, she gives him the wisdom that he lacked. Perhaps. Well, we'll find out. So now what I have to do is figure out where exactly we left off because I think we read 5 or 6 of the original Knight's stories, and I had promised to get a better translation than the one that we're using, and I failed to do that, so I apologize. I know I gave my better copy away to somebody, which annoys me. I don't know what happened to that other book and why I can't find it on the shelves here. I've had more than one copy of it, so that's quite frustrating. Well, where did we leave off? Let's see. I remember that we had the story of the genie whose son was killed by throwing a pit, right? So there was the merchant, right? So this is stories within stories within stories, right? So the story is of a person, of a character who tells a story, and that story that they tell is a part of the drama of their story. And so there were three sultans who came by who saw the fate of the merchant who was there a year after he was there before to keep his promise to the genie that now that his affairs are settled, he'll come back and the genie can kill him for having inadvertently murdered his son by eating a date and throwing the pit. And then the pit hit and then the genie popped out and became large and threatening with a sword. And then those three sultans, they each had where there were two dogs. There was the heifer. No, not the heifer. There were two dogs, oh dear Lord, I don't remember. In any event, they all had some sort of animals with them that had all been actual people that were enchanted in other ways. And so the sultans each said to the genie, if I give you an interesting story that's even more interesting than what's happening here, will you grant me a third of your claim of the blood of this merchant? And each time the story was so interesting that they saved his life in that way. And I believe that's probably where we left off. So let's see. The second sheik, the owner of the two hounds, advanced to the genie. If I relate to thee the story of myself and the three hounds, okay. And he says, yes. So then we get the story and then the third story of the third sheik, and then that's it. Okay. So I imagine that's where we left off. So we should be on no, because we started the fisherman. Okay. So nights 3 through 9 are the story of the fisherman now, not that merchant. And the fisherman is trying 4 times to catch something. He's desperate to find something of value. And he's throwing out his net and he's sort of frustrated and pleading with God that he'd be able to catch something because every time he throws out his net, it's so heavy he has to strip and get into the ocean and pull it out, and he gets like a boot and he gets these things full of mud and stuff that isn't valuable. And so he's getting quite desperate. But on the fourth time, he pulls out this urn, was it? Oh, no, it was a bottle. It was a bottle, and the smoke came out and filled up to the heavens, and it was a djinn, and it was an angry djinn who had been enslaved, imprisoned in the bottle by Solomon, and had put a seal on the cap, which the merchant or which the fisherman was careful not to break when he opened it. And the demon says, "Look, I have been there for a long time, and a certain number of centuries go by, and I start thinking to myself, I promise to grant any wishes to anyone who sets me free, and another 500 years go by, and I promise to, but now I'm so full of rage that I made a promise to murder whoever it was that finally set me free, and so you're going to die." And then there's this clever interaction between the fisherman and the genie where he says, "Look, he's kind of stalling a little bit to save his life for a while, but then he hits on this bright idea. He says, "Look, first of all, I don't believe you were ever in this bottle in the first place. You're very massive and large. There's no way you could fit in a bottle like this. It's not even possible. So, what's going on here?" He's basically calling the genie a liar. And so the gin turns himself into smoke and fits himself in the bottle, at which point, of course, the fisherman caps it and then throws it into the ocean and vows in conversation. They say, "Oh, if you let me free, I'll give you wishes." He goes, "No, I know that's not true." So he says, "I'm going to set up a house here, and anybody who comes by, I'm going to tell them that they should not fish in this area and that you're in the bottom of the ocean and till the hour of judgment, basically." So is that where we left off? The story of King Yunan and the sage Duban. I don't think we read that. Well, we'll find out. Let's pick up there. Know, O Ifrit, that there was in former times. Okay, now wait a minute. The fisherman answered as follows. So I and thou art like the vizier and King Yunan and the sage Duban. Okay, so let's go back because this story is intertwined with that story still. We're still with the fisherman. Um, let's see what's going on here. O fisherman, he answered, I will throw thee into the sea. Oh, okay. The Madrid, then addressing him with a soft voice and humble manner, said, what dost thou intend to do with me, O fisherman? He answered, I will throw thee into the sea. And if thou hast been there 1,800 years, I will make thee to remain there until the hour of judgment. Did I not say to thee, spare me, and so may God spare thee, and destroy me not, lest God destroy thee? But thou didst reject my petition, and wouldst nothing but treachery. Therefore God hath caused thee to fall into my hand, and I have betrayed thee. Open to me, said the Ifrit, that I may confer benefits upon thee. The fisherman replied, thou liest, thou accursed. I and thou are like the vizier of King Yunan and the sage Duban. What, said the Ifrit, was the case of the vizier Yunan and the sage Duban, and what is their story? The fisherman answered as follows. Know, O Ifrit, that there was in former times in the country of the Persians a monarch who was called King Yunan, possessing great treasures and numerous forces, valiant, and having troops of every description. But he was afflicted with leprosy, which the physicians and sages had failed to remove. Neither their potions, nor powders, nor ointments were of any benefit to him, and none of the physicians was able to cure him. At length there arrived at the city of this king a great sage, stricken in years, who was called the sage Duban. He was acquainted with ancient Greek, Persian, modern Greek, Arabic, and Syriac books, and with medicine and astrology, both with respect to their scientific principles and the rules of their practical applications for good and evil, as well as the properties of plants, dried and fresh, the injurious and the useful. He was versed in the wisdom of the philosophers and embraced a knowledge of all the medical and other sciences. After the sage had arrived in the city and remained in it a few days, he heard of the case of the king, of the leprosy with which God had afflicted him, and with the physicians and men of science, and that the physicians and men of science had failed to cure him. In consequence of this information, he passed the next night in deep study. And when the morning came and diffused its light, it would be very helpful is if I stop trying to read without better lighting. Let me just turn this on here. Uh-oh. That's not what we meant to turn on. Hold on. There we go. So sorry. So he stays up all night studying. And when the morning came and diffused its light, and the sun saluted the ornament of the good, he attired himself in the richest of his apparel and presented himself before the king, having kissed the ground before him and offering up a prayer for the continuance of his power and happiness, and greeted him in the best manner he was able. He informed him who he was and said, O king, I have heard of the disease which hath attacked thy person, and that many of the physicians are unacquainted with the means of removing it. And I will cure thee without giving thee to drink any potion or anything thee or anointing thee with ointment. When King Human heard his words, he wondered and said to him, how wilt thou do this? By Allah, if thou cure me, I will enrich thee and thy children's children, and I will heap favors upon thee, and whatever thou shalt desire shall be thine, and thou shalt be my companion and my friend. He then bestowed upon him a robe of honor and other presents, and said to him, wilt thou cure me of this disease without potion or ointment? He answered, yes, I will cure thee without any discomfort to thy person. And the king was extremely astonished and said, O sage, At what time and on what day shall that which thou hast proposed to me be done? Hasten it, O my son, he answered. I hear and obey. He then went out from the presence of the king and hired a house, in which he deposited his books and medicines and drugs. Having done this, he selected certain of his medicines and drugs and made a golf stick with a hollow handle, into which he introduced them. After which he made a ball for it, skillfully adapted. And on the following day, after he had finished these, he went again to the king and kissed the ground before him and directed him to repair to the horse course and to play with the ball and golf stick. The king, attended by his emirs and chamberlains and viziers, went thither. And as soon as he arrived there, the sage Duban presented himself before him and handed to him the golf stick, saying, take this golf stick and grasp it thus, and ride along the horse course, and strike the ball with it with all thy force, until the palm of thy hand and thy whole body become moist with perspiration. When the medicine will penetrate into thy hand and pervade thy whole body, and when thou hast done this, the medicine remains in thee. Return to thy palace, and enter the bath, and wash thyself, and sleep. Then shalt thou find thyself cured, and peace be on thee. So King Unan took the golf stick from the sage and grasped it in his hand, and mounted his horse. And the ball was thrown before him, and he urged his horse after it until he overtook it, when he struck it with all his force. And when he had continued this exercise as long as was necessary, and bathed and slept, and looked upon his skin, and not a vestige of the leprosy remained, it was clear as white silver. Upon this he rejoiced exceedingly. His heart was dilated, and he was full of happiness. On the following morning, he entered the council chamber and sat upon his throne, and the chamberlains and great officers of his court came before him. The sage Duban also presented himself, and when the king saw him, he rose to him in haste and seated him by his side. Services of food were then spread before them, and the sage ate with the king and remained as his guest all the day. And when the night approached, the king gave him 2,000 pieces of gold, besides dresses of honor and other presents, and mounted him on his own horse. And so the sage returned to his house. And the king was astonished at his skill, saying, this man hath cured me by an external process, without anointing me with ointment. By Allah, this is consummate science, and it is incumbent on me to bestow favors and honors upon him, and to make him my companion and familiar friend as long as I live. He passed the night happy and joyful on account of his recovery. And when he arose, he went forth again and sat upon his throne, the officers of his court standing before him, and the emirs and viziers sitting on his right hand and on his left. And he called for the sage Duban, who came and kissed the ground before him. And the king rose and seated him by his side, and ate with him, and greeted him with compliments. He bestowed upon him again a robe of honor and other presents. And after conversing with him till the approach of night, gave orders that 5 other robes of honor should be given to him, that 1,000 pieces of gold, and the sage and 1,000 pieces of gold, and the sage departed and returned to his house. Again, when the next morning came, the king went as usual to his council chamber, and the emirs and viziers and chamberlains surrounded him. Now there was among his viziers one of ill aspect and of evil star, sordid, avaricious, and of an envious and malicious disposition. And when he saw that the king had made the sage Duban his friend and bestowed upon him these favors, he envied him his distinction and meditated evil against him. Agreeably with the adage, I'm sorry, agreeably with the adage which saith, there is no one void of envy, and another which saith, tyranny lurketh in the soul, power manifesteth it, and weakness concealeth it. So he approached the king and kissed the ground before him and said, O king of the age, thou art he whose goodness extendeth to all men, and I have an important piece of advice to give thee. If I were to conceal it from thee, I should be a base born wretch. Therefore, if thou order me to impart it, I will do so." The king, disturbed by these words of the vizier, said, "What is thy advice?" He answered, "O glorious king, it hath been said by the ancients, he who looketh not to results, fortune will not attend him. Now, I have seen the king in a way that is not right, since he hath bestowed favors upon his enemy, and upon him who desireth the downfall of his dominion. He hath treated him with kindness, and honored him with the highest honors, and admitted him to the closest intimacy. I therefore fear for the king the consequence of this conduct." At this, the king was troubled, and his countenance changed, and he said, "Who is he whom thou regardest as mine enemy, and to whom I shew kindness?" He replied, "O king, if thou hast been asleep, awake. I allude to the sage Duban." The king said, "He is my intimate companion, and the dearest of men in my estimation, for he restored me by a thing that I merely held in my hand, and cured me of the disease which the physicians were unable to remove. And there is not now to be found one like to him in the whole world, from west to east. Wherefore then dost thou utter these words against him? I will, from this day, appoint him a regular salary and maintenance, and give him every month 1,000 pieces of gold. And if I give him a share of my kingdom, it were but a small thing to do unto him. I do not think that thou hast said this from any other motive than that of envy. If I didst what thou desirest, I should repent after it, as the man repented who killed his parrot. Ah, I'm not going to be able to finish the story till the next night. All right, you live one more day. What is the story of the husband and the parrot? So we're 8 stories deep now, right? We got to get this story in order to get back to the right. This is kind of fun. There was a certain merchant of an exceedingly jealous disposition, having a wife endowed with perfect beauty, who had prevented him from leaving his house. But an event happened which obliged him to make a journey, and when he found his doing so to be indispensable, he went to the market in which birds were sold, and bought a parrot, which he placed in his house to act as a spy, that on his return she might inform him of what passed during his absence. For this parrot was cunning and intelligent, and remembered whatever she heard. So when he had made his journey and accomplished his business, right? So this is the king telling the story. We understand. Okay. So when he had made his journey and accomplished his business, he returned and caused the parrot to be brought to him, and asked her respecting the conduct of his wife. She answered, "Thy wife has a lover, who visited her every night during thy absence." And when the man heard this, he fell into a violent rage, and went to his wife and gave her a severe beating. The woman imagined that one of the female slaves had informed him of what had passed between her and her paramour during his absence. She therefore called them together and made them swear, and they all swore that they had not told their master anything of the matter, but confessed that they had heard the parrot relate to him what had passed. Having thus established on the testimony of the slaves the fact of the parrot's having informed her husband of her intrigue, she ordered one of these slaves to grind with a hand mill under the cage, another to sprinkle water from above, and a third to move a mirror from side to side during the next night on which her husband was absent. And on the following morning, when the man returned from an entertainment at which he had been present, and inquired again of the parrot what had passed that night during his absence, the bird answered, "Oh, my master, I could neither see nor hear anything on account of the excessive darkness and thunder and lightning and rain." Now, this happened during summer. So he said to her, "What strange words are these? It is now summer, when nothing of what thou hast described ever happens." The parrot, however, swore by Allah the Great that that what she had said was true, and that it had so happened. Upon which the man, not understanding the case, nor knowing the plot, became violently enraged, and took out the bird from the cage and threw her down upon the ground with such violence that he killed her. But after some days, one of his female slaves informed him of the truth. Yet he would not believe it until he saw his wife's paramour going out from his house, when he drew his sword and slew the traitor by a blow on the back of his neck. So also did he to his treacherous wife, and thus both of them went laden with the sin which they had committed to the fire. And the merchant discovered that the parrot had informed him truly of what she had seen, and he mourned grievously for her loss. When the vizier heard these words of King Yunan, he said, O king of great dignity, what hath this crafty sage, this man from whom naught but mischief proceedeth, done unto me, that I should be his enemy and speak evil of him, and plot with thee to destroy him? I have informed thee respecting him in com- I have informed thee respecting him in compassion for thee, and in fear of his despoiling thee of thy happiness. And if my words be not true, destroy me, as the vizier of El Sindbad was destroyed. Oh, as the vizier of El Sindbad was destroyed. The king asked, how was that? And the vizier thus answered, ah, it's too late to finish that story. We'll have to wait till tomorrow night. And then the next night comes round. Tell me, they took all of this out, which is why I don't like this translation, but they took all of the repetitive conversation between Scheherazade and King Shalimar. It's very important. But in any event, they just get to the next story. We'll find a better translation eventually. Okay, the story of the envious vizier. Oh, what happened? What happened with the vizier? What happened? Okay. And the prince and the gula. The king above mentioned had a son who was ardently, so now, of course, the vizier is telling the king this story about, taking responsibility. And of course, I'm saying the truth and all that. Okay. The king above mentioned had a son who was ardently fond of the chase, and he had a vizier whom he charged to be always with his son wherever he went. One day the son went forth to hunt, and his father's vizier was with him. And as they rode together, they saw a great wild beast, upon which the vizier exclaimed to the prince, away after this wild beast. The king's son pursued it until he was out of sight of his attendants, and the beast also escaped from before his eyes in the desert. And while the prince wandered in perplexity, not knowing whither to direct his course, he met in his way a damsel who was weeping. He said to her, who art thou? And she answered, I am a daughter of one of the kings of India. I was in the desert, and slumber overtook me, and I fell from my horse in a state of insensibility. And being thus separated from my attendants, I lost my way. The prince, on hearing this, pitied her forlorn state, and placed her behind him on his horse. And as they proceeded, they passed by a ruin. And the damsel said to him, O my master, I would alight here for a little while. The prince therefore lifted her from his horse at this ruin. But she delayed so long to return that he wondered wherefore she had loitered so, and, entering after her without her knowledge, perceived that she was a Gula, and heard her say, My children, I have brought you today a fat young man, on which they exclaimed, Bring him to us, bring him in to us, O mother, that we may fill our stomachs with his flesh. When the prince heard their words, he felt assured of destruction. The muscles of his sides quivered, and fear overcame him, and he retreated. The Gula then came forth, and seeing that he appeared alarmed and fearful, and that he was trembling, said to him, Wherefore dost thou fear? He answered, I have an enemy of whom I am in fear. The Gula said, Thou assertest thyself to be the son of the king. He replied, Yes. Then she said, Wherefore dost thou not give some money to thine enemy, and so conciliate him? He answered, He will not be appeased with money, nor with anything but life, and therefore do I fear him. I am an injured man. She then said to him, If thou be an injured man, as thou affirmest, beg aid of God against thine oppressor, and he will avert from thee his mischievous design. and that of every other person whom thou fearest. Upon this, therefore, the prince raised his head towards heaven and said, O thou who answerest the distressed when he prayeth to thee, and dispellest evil, assist me, and cause mine enemy to depart from me. For thou art able to do whatsoever thou wilt. And the Gula no sooner heard his prayer than she departed from him. The prince then returned to his father and informed him of the conduct of the vizier, upon which the king gave orders that the minister should be put to death. So remember, the king says, you always stick by my son's side. They got excited in the hunt to chase the beast. They lost sight of him. And this is how it's come about. And thou, O king, continued the vizier of King Yunan, if thou trust in this sage, he will kill thee in the foulest manner. If thou continue to bestow favors upon him and to make him thine intimate companion, he will plot thy destruction. Dost thou not see that he hath cured thee of the disease by external means, by a thing that thou heldest in thy hand? Therefore thou art not secure against his killing thee by a thing that thou shalt hold in the same manner. King Yunan answered, Thou hast spoken truth. The case is as thou hast said, O faithful vizier. It is probable that this sage came as a spy to accomplish my death. And if he cured me by a thing I held in my hand, he may destroy me by a thing that I may smell. What then, O vizier, shall be done respecting him? The vizier answered, Send to him immediately, and desire him to come hither. And when he is come, strike off his head, and so shalt thou avert from thee his evil design and be secure from him. Betray him before he betray thee. The king said, Thou hast spoken right. Immediately, therefore, he sent for the sage, who came full of joy, not knowing what the compassionate had decreed against him, and addressed the king with these words of the poet: If I fail any day to render thee due thanks, tell me for whom I have composed my verse and prose. Thou hast loaded me with favors unsolicited, bestowed without delay on thy part or excuse. How then should I abstain from praising thee as thou deservest, and lauding thee both with my heart and voice? Nay, I will thank thee for thy benefits conferred upon me. They are light upon my tongue, though weighty to my back. Knowest thou, said the king, wherefore I have summoned thee? The sage answered, None knoweth what is secret but God, whose name be exalted. Then said the king, I have summoned thee that I may take away thy life. The sage, in the utmost astonishment at this announcement, said, O king, wherefore wouldst thou kill me? And what offense hath been committed by me? The king answered, It hath been told me that thou art a spy, and that thou hast come hither to kill me. But I will prevent thee by killing thee first. And so saying, he called out to the executioner, Strike off the head of this traitor, and relieve me from his wickedness. Spare me, said the sage. Spare me, said the sage, and so may God spare thee, and destroy me not, lest God destroy thee. And he repeated these words several times, like as I did, O Ifrit. Remember, it's the fisherman who's originally telling the story to the demon that he's about to cast into the ocean. Just like I said to you, but thou wouldst not let me go, desiring to destroy me. King Yunan then said to the sage Duban, I shall not be secure unless I kill thee, for thou curest curedst me by a thing that I held in my hand, and I have no security against thy killing me by a thing that I may smell, or by some other means. O king, said the sage, is this my recompense from thee? Dost thou return evil for good? The king answered, Thou must be slain without delay. When the sage, therefore, was convinced that the king intended to put him to death, and that his fate was inevitable, he lamented the benefit that he had done to the undeserving. The executioner then advanced and bandaged his eyes, and having drawn his sword, said, "Give permission." Upon this, the sage wept and said again, "Spare me, and so may God spare thee, and destroy me not, lest God destroy thee. Wouldst thou return me the recompense of the crocodile?" "What," said the king, "is the story of the crocodile?" The sage answered, "I cannot relate it while in this condition, but I conjure thee by Allah to spare me, and so may he spare thee." And he wept bitterly. Then one of the chief officers of the king arose and said, "O king, give up to me the blood of this sage, for we have not seen him commit any offense against thee, nor have we seen him do aught but cure thee of thy disease, which wearied the other physicians and sages." The king answered, "Ye know not the reason whereof I would kill the sage. It is this, that if I suffered him to live, I should myself inevitably perish. For he who cured me of the disease under which I suffered by a thing that I held in my hand may kill me by a thing that I may smell. And I fear that he would do so and would receive an appointment on account of it, seeing that it is probable he is a spy who hath come hither to kill me. I must therefore kill him, and then shall I feel myself safe." The sage then said again, "Spare me, and so may God spare thee, and destroy me not, lest God destroy thee." But he now felt certain, O Ifrit, that the king would put him to death, and that there was no escape for him. So he said, "O king, if my death is indispensable, grant me some respite, that I may return to my house and acquit myself of my duties and give directions to my family and neighbors to bury me and dispose of my medical books. And among my books is one of the most especial value, which I offer as a present to thee, that thou mayest treasure it in thy library." "And what," said the king, "is this book?" He answered, "It contains things not to be enumerated. And the smallest of the secret virtues that it possesses is this, that when thou hast cut off my head, if thou open this book and count 3 leaves, and then read 3 lines on the page to the left, the head will speak to thee and answer whatever thou shalt ask." At this, the king was excessively astonished and shook with delight, and said to him, "O sage, when I have cut off thy head, will it speak?" He answered, "Yes, O king, and this is a wonderful thing." The king then sent him to the custody of guards, sent him in the custody of guards, and the sage descended to his house and settled all his affairs on that day. And on the following day he went up to the court, and the emirs and viziers and chamberlains and deputies and all the great officers of the state went thither also, and the court resembled a flower garden. And when the sage had entered, he presented himself before the king, bearing an old book and a small pot containing a powder. And he sat down and said, "Bring me a tray." So they brought him one, and he poured out the powder into it and spread it. He then said, "O king, take this book, and do nothing with it until thou hast cut off my head. And when thou hast done so, place it upon this tray, and order someone to press it down upon the powder. And when this is done, the blood will be stanched. Then open the book." As soon as the sage had said this, the king gave orders to strike off his head, and it was done. The king then opened the book and found that its leaves were stuck together. So he put his finger to his mouth and moistened it with his spittle, and opened the first leaf and the second and the third. But the leaves were not opened without difficulty. He opened 6 leaves and looked at them, but found upon them no writing. So he said, "O sage, there is nothing written in it." The head of the sage answered, "Turn over more leaves." The king did so, and in a little while the poison penetrated into his system, for the book was poisoned. And the king fell back and cried out, "The poison hath penetrated into me." And upon this, the head of the sage Duban repeated these verses: "They made use of their power and used it tyrannically, and soon it became as though it never had existed. Had they acted equitably, they had experienced equity. But they oppressed, wherefore fortune pressed them with calamities and trials. Then did the case itself announce to them, "This is the reward of your conduct, and fortune is blameless." And when the head of the sage Duban had uttered these words, the king immediately fell down dead. "Now, O Ifrit," continued the fisherman, "know that if King Yunnan had spared the sage Duban, God had spared him. But he refused and desired his destruction. Therefore, God destroyed him. And thou, O Ifrit, if thou hadst spared me, God had spared thee, and I had spared thee. But thou desiredst my death. Therefore will I put thee to death, imprisoned in this bottle, and will throw thee here into the sea." The Marid upon this cried out and said, "I conjure thee by Allah, O fisherman, that thou do it not. Spare me in generosity, and be not angry with me for what I did. But if I have done evil, do thou good, according to the proverb. O thou benefactor of him who hath done evil, the action that he hath done is sufficient for him. Do not therefore, as Umama did to Atika." "And what," said the fisherman, "was their case?" The Ifrit answered, "This is not a time for telling stories. When I am in this prison, but when thou liberatest me, I will relate to thee their case." The fisherman said, "Thou must be thrown into the sea, and there shall be no way of escape for thee from it. For I endeavored to propitiate thee, and humbled myself before thee, yet thou wouldst nothing but my destruction. Thou, or though I had committed no offense to deserve it, and had done no evil to thee, no evil to thee whatever, but only good, delivering thee from thy confinement. And when thou didst thus unto me, I perceived that thou wast radically corrupt. And I would have thee know that my motive for throwing thee into this sea, is that I may acquaint with thy story everyone that shall take thee out, and caution him against thee, that he may cast thee in again. Thus shalt thou remain in this sea to the end of time, and experience varieties of torment." The Ifrit then said, "Liberate me, for this is an opportunity for thee to display humanity, and I vow to thee that I will never do thee harm, but, on the contrary, will do thee a service that shall enrich thee forever." Upon this, the fisherman accepted his covenant that he would not hurt him, but that he would do him good. And when he had bound him by oaths and vows, and made him swear by the most great name of God, he opened to him, and the smoke ascended until it had all come forth, and then collected together, and became, as before, an Ifrit of hideous form. The Ifrit then kicked the bottle into the sea. When the fisherman saw him do this, he made sure of destruction, and said, "This is no sign of good." But afterwards he fortified his heart and said, "O Ifrit, God, whose name be exalted, hath said, Perform the covenant, for the covenant shall be inquired into. And thou hast covenanted with me, and sworn that thou wilt not act treacherously towards me. Therefore, if thou so act, God will recompense thee, for he is jealous, he respiteth, but suffereth not to escape. And remember that I said to thee, as said the sage Duban to King Yunnan, spare me, and so may God spare thee." The Ifrit laughed and walked on before him, said, "O fisherman, follow me." The fisherman did so, not believing in his escape, until they had quitted the neighborhood of the city and ascended a mountain and descended into a wide desert tract, in the midst of which was a lake of water. Here the Ifrit stopped and ordered the fisherman to cast his net and take some fish. And the fisherman, looking into the lake, saw in it fish of different colors, white and red and blue and yellow, at which he was astonished, and he cast his net and drew it in, and found in it four fish, each fish of a different color from the others, at the sight of which he rejoiced. The Ifrit then said to him, take them to the Sultan and present them to him, and he will give thee what will enrich thee. And for the sake of God, accept my excuse, for at present I know no other way of rewarding thee, having been in the sea 1,800 years, and not seen the surface of the earth until now. But take not fish from the lake more than once each day, and now I commend thee to the care of God. Having thus said, he struck the earth with his feet, and it clove asunder and swallowed him. The fisherman then went back to the city, wondering at all that had befallen him with the Ifrit, and carried the fish to his house. And he took an earthen bowl, and having filled it with water, put the fish into it. And they struggled in the water. And when he had done this, he placed the bowl upon his head, and repaired to the king's palace, as the Ifrit had commanded him. And going up unto the king, presented to him the fish. And the king was excessively astonished at them, for he had never seen anything like them in the course of his life. And he said, give these fish to the slave cookmaid. This maid had been sent as a present to him by the king of the Greeks 3 days before, and he had not yet tried her skill. The vizier therefore ordered her to fry the fish, and said to her, O maid, the king saith unto thee, I have not reserved, I have not reserved my tear, but for the time of my difficulty. Today, then, gratify us by a specimen of thy excellent cookery. For a person hath brought these fish as a present to the Sultan. After having thus charged her, the vizier returned, and the king ordered him to give the fisherman 400 pieces of gold. So the vizier gave them to him, and he took them in his lap, and returned to his home and his wife, joyful and happy, and bought what was needful for his family. So I almost paused a moment ago because it sounds ridiculous to imagine that the fisherman might let the genie out, but he doesn't let him out until there's oaths and covenants made. So there's a hint that perhaps in the stories that's a part of the nature of the jinn is that they can't break oaths, but they can trickily act as though they're going to give you what you want. But it sounds right, but it's not a sworn promise, and then they always have a way out or something like that. Anyway, let's see. Such were the events that befell the fisherman. Now, we must relate what happened to the maid. She took the fish and cleaned them and arranged them in the frying pan and left them until one side was cooked, when she turned them upon the other side. And lo, the wall of the kitchen clove asunder, and there came forth from it a damsel of tall stature, smooth cheeked, of perfect form, with eyes adorned with kohl, beautiful in countenance, and with heavy, swelling hips, wearing a kufieh interwoven with blue silk, with rings in her ears and bracelets on her wrists, and rings set with precious jewels on her fingertips. And in her hand was a rod of Indian cane. And she dipped the end of the rod in the frying pan and said, O fish, are ye remaining faithful to your covenant? At the sight of this, the cookmaid fainted. The damsel then repeated the same words a second and a third time, after which the fish raised their heads from the frying pan and answered, Yes, yes. They then repeated the following verse: If thou return, we return, and if thou come, we come, and if thou forsake, we verily do the same. And upon this, the damsel overturned the frying pan and departed by the way she had entered. And the wall of the kitchen closed up again. The cookmaid then arose and beheld the four fish burnt like charcoal, and she exclaimed, In his first encounter, his staff broke. And as she sat, reproaching herself, she beheld the vizier standing at her head, and he said to her, Bring the fish to the Sultan. And she wept and informed him of what had happened. The vizier was astonished at her words and exclaimed, "This is indeed a wonderful event." And he sent for the fisherman. And when he was brought, he said to him, "O fisherman, thou must bring for us 4 fish like those which thou broughtest before." The fisherman accordingly went forth to the lake and threw his net. And when he had drawn it in, he found in it 4 fish as before, and he took them to the vizier. He went with them to the maid and said to her, "Rise and fry them in my presence, that I may witness this occurrence." The maid therefore prepared the fish and put them in the frying pan. And they had remained but a little while when the wall clove asunder, and the damsel appeared clad as before, and holding the rod. And she dipped the end of the rod in the frying pan and said, O fish, are ye remaining faithful to your old covenant? Upon which they raised their heads and answered as before. And the damsel overturned the frying pan with the rod and returned by the way she had entered, and the wall closed up again. The vizier then said, "This is an event which cannot be concealed from the king." So he went to him and informed him of what had happened in his presence. And the king said, "I must see this with my own eyes." He sent therefore to the fisherman and commanded him to bring 4 fish like the former, granting him a delay of 3 days. And the fisherman repaired to the lake and brought the fish thence to the king, who ordered again that 400 pieces of gold should be given to him. And then, returning to the vizier, said to him, "Cook the fish thyself here before me." The vizier answered, "I hear and obey." He brought the frying pan, and after he had cleaned the fish, threw them into it. And as soon as he had turned them, the wall clove asunder, and there came forth from it a negro, in size like a bull, or like one of the tribe of Ad, having in his hand a branch of a green tree. And he said with a clear and terrifying voice, O fish, are ye remaining faithful to your old covenant?" Upon which they raised their heads and answered as before, "Yes, yes. If thou return, we return. If thou come, we come. And if thou forsake, we verily do the same." The black then approached the frying pan and overturned it with the branch, and the fish became like charcoal, and he went away as he had come. When he had thus disappeared from before their eyes, the king said, "This is an event respecting which it is impossible to keep silence, and there must undoubtedly be some strange circumstance connected with these fish." He then ordered that the fisherman should be brought before him. And when he had come, he said to him, "Whence came these fish?" The fisherman answered, "From a lake between 4 mountains, between this mountain, which is without thy city." The king said to him, "How many days' journey distant?" He answered, "Oh, our lord the Sultan, a journey of half an hour." And the Sultan was astonished and ordered his troops to go out immediately with him and the fisherman, who began to curse the Ifrit. They proceeded until they had ascended the mountain and descended into a wide desert tract which they had never before seen in their whole lives. And the Sultan and all the troops wondered at the sight of the desert, which was between 4 mountains, and at the fish, which were of 4 colors, red and white and yellow and blue. The king paused in astonishment and said to the troops and to the other attendants who were with him, "Hath any one of you before seen this lake in this place?" They all answered, "No." Then said the king, "By Allah, I will not enter my city, nor will I sit upon my throne until I know the true history of this lake and of its fish." And upon this he ordered his people to encamp around these mountains, and they did so. He then called for the vizier, who was a well informed, sensible, prudent, and learned man. And when he had presented himself before him, he said to him, "I desire to do a thing with which I will acquaint thee. And it is this: I have resolved to depart alone this night to seek for information respecting this lake and its fish. Therefore, sit thou at the door of my pavilion, and say to the emirs and viziers and chamberlains, the Sultan is sick, and hath commanded me not to allow any person to go in unto him, and acquaint no one with my intention." The vizier was unable to oppose his design. So the king disguised himself and slung on his sword and withdrew himself from the midst of his troops. He journeyed the whole of the night until the morning and proceeded until the heat became oppressive to him. He then paused to rest, after which he again proceeded the remainder of the day and the second night until the morning, when there appeared before him in the distance something black, at the sight of which he rejoiced and said, "Perhaps I shall there find some person who will inform me of the history of the lake and its fish." And when he approached this black object, he found it to be a palace built of black stones and overlaid with iron, and one of the leaves of its door was open and the other shut. The king was glad, and he stood at the door and knocked gently, but heard no answer. He knocked a second and a third time, but again heard no answer. Then he knocked a fourth time, and with violence, but no one answered. So he said, "It is doubtless empty." And he took courage and entered from the door into the passage, and cried out, saying, "O inhabitants of the palace, I am a stranger and a traveler. Have ye any provision?" And he repeated these words a second and a third time, but heard no answer. And upon this he fortified his heart, emboldened himself, and proceeded from the passage into the midst of the palace. But he found no one there, and only saw that it was furnished, and that there was, in the center of it, a fountain with four lions of red gold, which poured forth the water from their mouths like pearls and jewels. Around this were birds, and over the top of the palace was extended a net, which prevented their flying out. At the sight of these objects he was astonished, and he was grieved that he saw no person there whom he could ask for information respecting the lake, and the fish, and the mountains, and the palace. He then sat down between the doors, reflecting upon these things. And as he thus sat, he heard a voice of lamentation from a sorrowful heart chanting these verses: "O fortune, O fortune, thou pitiest me not, nor releasest me. See, my heart is straitened between affliction and peril. Will not you, O my wife, have compassion on the mighty whom thou hast abased, and the wealthy who is reduced to indigence? We were jealous even of the zephyr which passed over you. But when the divine decree is issued, the eye becometh blind. What resource hath the archer when, in the hour of conflict, he desireth to discharge the arrow, but findeth his bowstring broken? And when troubles are multiplied upon the noble minded, where shall he find refuge from fate and from destiny? When the Sultan heard this lamentation, he sprang upon his feet, and seeking the direction whence it proceeded, found a curtain suspended before the door of a chamber, and he raised it, and beheld behind it a young man sitting on a couch raised to the height of a cubit from the floor. He was a handsome youth, well shaped and of eloquent speech, with shining forehead and rosy cheek, marked with a mole resembling ambergris. The king was rejoiced at seeing him and saluted him, and the young man, who remained sitting and was clad with a vest of silk embroidered with gold, but who exhibited traces of grief, returned his salutation and said to him, "O my master, excuse me my rising." "O youth," said the king, inform me respecting the lake and its fish of various colors, and respecting this palace, and the reason of thy being alone in it, and of thy lamentation." When the young man heard these words, tears trickled down his cheeks, and he wept bitterly. And the king was astonished, and said to him, "What causeth thou to weep, O youth?" He answered, "How can I refrain from weeping, when this is my state?" And so saying, he stretched forth his hand and lifted up the skirts of his clothing, and lo, half of him, from the waist to the soles of his feet, was stone, and from his waist to the hair of his head he was like other men. He then said, "Know, O king, that the story of the fish is extraordinary. If it were engraved upon the intellect, it would be a lesson to him who would be admonished." And he related it as follows. So we're still not done with the fisherman yet. I think we should stop there. Although it's hard to stop. The stories are very interesting and they keep just leading one right into the next. Um, but I think that's where we'll stop for tonight. So we're going to do things differently. This is a cool new project. One, I can't find my copy of the other book that we read last time, where we read the first chapter, and I would love to read the second chapter of that now. So if you give me one more moment to try to find a PDF version of this, or buy it on Kindle, or see what I can do here somehow. Let's see. Maybe we should just buy it on Kindle. It was quite a good first chapter. Okay. I don't know why Amazon thinks the title of that book. No results, huh? That seems unlikely. Okay, that looks good. Let's go grab this. Okay, so here's the book. Boom, 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 pa-doom, pa-doom, doom. Um, oh, is that all it takes? Is one click? See if that worked somehow. So remember the first chapter. It was really impressive. We could look it up here. I don't see the book in the list here of books. Oh, do I refresh? Sync. Sync is what we need. Hey, there it is. Holy mackerel, we have it. Pending, downloading. Here we go. Awesome. Okay, very cool. So we did end up finding a way of getting a hold of this book. So this is one of Salman Rushdie's 6 or 8 masterpieces. He has a lot. All of his books are great, but this is one of the maybe top 3 even. Certainly in the class of masterpieces. It says it should be able to open now, right? Hey, learn smarter, not harder. Before you dive into your next reading adventure, no, don't show me as the only option. I don't want to see that. Hey, cool. Here we are. Okay. The book is called 2 Years, 8 Months, and 28 Nights, which of course adds up to 1001. And what we've seen so far is something happening, I think, in the 1200s. Wait a minute. Where was it? Might have been later than that. Hold on a moment. Ah, interesting. Okay. Do. So that was called The Children of Ibn Rushd. And so Dunia, who was a genie, a geniera, we could, it's all about genies and stuff happening. She is in love with Ibn Rushd, the philosopher who Salman Rushdie's father renamed their family after Rushdie. Um, as well. He's the philosopher who, of course, was debating with Ghazali and, having different perspectives, wrote The Incoherence of the Incoherence against Ghazali's Incoherence of the Philosophers, which we will be looking at in our year 2 readings when we start that course. We talked about all that last time, so y'all can go and catch up on that by looking at it from the last video if you like. But here we go. So the next chapter takes place in present time, which is happening, I think, 2 millennia from when this is being written. Like, this is being written as a history book, but it calls our time the time of the strangenesses, where the slits between the worlds of fairyland or Paristan allow jinns and Janira and all of these creatures to start coming back in again. And that's how he describes the time we're in right now. It's actually quite helpful to just have read the 1001 Nights. You remember, I thought of a phrase, the slits between the worlds, and we just read stories about the wall cleaving asunder and all of this, and also the ground opening up and the genie going away. And so, in any event, this is chapter 2. 800 or more years later, More than 3,500 miles away, and now more than 1,000 years ago, a storm fell upon our ancestors' city like a bomb. Their childhood slipped into the water and were lost. The piers, built of memories out of which they once ate candy and pizza. The boardwalks of desire under which they had hid from the summer sun and kissed their first lips. The roofs of houses flew through the night sky like like disoriented bats. And the attics which they stored, I'm sorry, we'll make this a little larger and we won't have so many problems. No, that's search. Why is the search magnifying glass the same as the make larger? Uno momento, por favor, my friends. Yeah, that doesn't make it any larger. It just goes full screen. It's the same thing. Okay, bear with me. I never use Kindle. Would you stop changing the page? All right, let's just get closer to the screen. All right. Their childhoods slipped into the water and were lost. The piers built of memories on which they once ate candy and pizza. The boardwalks of desire under which they hid from the summer sun and kissed their first lips. The roofs of houses flew through the night sky like like disoriented bats, and the attics where they stored their past stood exposed to the elements until it seemed that everything they once were had been devoured by the predatory sky. Their secrets drowned in flooded basements, and they could no longer remember them. Their power failed them. Darkness fell. Before the power died, the TV showed images taken from the sky of an immense white spiral wheeling overhead like an invading alien spaceship. Then the river poured into the power stations, and trees fell on the power cables and crushed the sheds where the emergency generators were housed, and the apocalypse began. Some rope that moored our ancestors to reality snapped, and as the elements screamed in their ears, it was easy for them to believe that the slits in the world had reopened, the seals had been broken, and there were laughing sorcerers in the sky, satanic horsemen riding the galloping clouds. For 3 days and nights, nobody spoke because only the language of the storm existed in our ancestors. And only the language of the storm existed, and our ancestors did not know how to speak that awful tongue. Then at last it passed, and like children refusing to believe in childhood's end, they wanted everything to be as it was. But when the light returned, it felt different. This was a white light they had not seen before, harsh as an interrogator's lamp, casting no shadows, merciless, leaving no place to hide. Beware, the light seemed to say, for I come to burn and judge. Then the strangenesses began. They would continue for 2 years, 8 months, and 28 nights. This is how it has come down to us a millennium later. As history infused with the perhaps overwhelmed by legend, this is how we think of it now, as if it were an infallible memory or a dream of the remote past. If it's untrue or partly untrue, if made up stories have been introduced into the record, it's too late to do anything about it. This is the story of our ancestors as we choose to tell it. And so, of course, it's our story too. It was on the Wednesday after the great storm that Mr. Geronimo first noticed that his feet no longer touched the ground. He had awoken an hour before dawn as usual, half remembering a strange dream in which a woman's lips were pressed against his chest, murmuring inaudibly. His nose was blocked, his mouth dry because he'd been breathing through it in his sleep, his neck stiff thanks to his habit of putting too many pillows beneath it. The eczema on his left ankle needed to be scratched. The body in general was giving him the familiar amount of morning grief. Nothing to moan about, in other words. The feet, in fact, felt fine. Mr. Geronimo had had trouble with his feet for much of his life, but they were being kind today. From time to time, he suffered the pain of his fallen arches, even though he meticulously did his toe clenching exercises. Last last thing at night before going to sleep and first thing after waking up, and he wore insoles and went up and down stairs on his toes. Then there was the battle with gout and the medication that brought on diarrhea. The pain came periodically and he accepted it, consoling himself with what he had learned as a young man, that flat feet allowed you to dodge the military draft. Mr. Geronimo was long past the soldiering age, but this scrap of information still comforted him. And gout, after all, was the disease of kings. Lately, his heels had been forming thick, cracked calluses that needed attention, but he had been too busy to visit a podiatrist. He needed his feet, was on them all day. Also, they had had a couple of days of rest, no gardening to be done during a storm like this one, so perhaps they were rewarding him this morning by choosing not to make a fuss. He swung his legs out of bed and stood up. Something did feel different then. He was familiar with the texture of the polished wooden floorboards in his bedroom, but for some reason he didn't feel them that Wednesday morning. There was a new softness underfoot, a kind of soothing nothingness. Maybe his feet had become numb, deadened by the thickening calluses. A man of his type, an older man with a day of hard physical work ahead of him, did not bother with such trifles. A man of his type, big, fit, strong, shrugged off niggles and got on with his day. There was still no power and very little water, though the return of both was promised for the next day. Mr. Geronimo was a fastidious person, and it pained him not to clean his teeth thoroughly, not to shower. He used some of the water that remained in his bathtub to flush the toilet. He had filled it as a precaution before the storm began. He climbed into his work overalls and boots and, ignoring the stalled elevator, ventured down into the ruined streets. At 60 plus, he told himself, having reached an age at which most men would be putting their feet up, he was as fit and active as he'd ever been. The life he chose long ago had seen to that. It had taken him away from his father's church of miracle curses, of screaming women rising from wheelchairs because possessed by the power of Christ, and away from his uncle's architectural practice, where he might have spent long, invisible, sedentary years drafting that kindly gentleman's unrecognized visions, his floor plans of disappointments and frustrations and things that might have been. Mr. Geronimo had left Jesus and drafting tables behind and moved into the open air. In the green pickup truck, on whose sides the words Mr. Geronimo Gardner and a phone number and website URL were blocked out in yellow and drop shadowed in scarlet, he couldn't feel the seat underneath him. The cracked green leather that usually poked comfortingly into the right cheek of his behind wasn't doing its thing today. He was definitely not himself. There was a general lessening of sensation. This was a worry. At his age, and given his chosen field of work, he had to be concerned about the small betrayals of the body, had to deal with them to stave off the larger betrayals that awaited. He would have to get himself checked out, but not now. Right now, in the aftermath of the storm, the doctors and hospitals had bigger problems to worry about. The accelerator and brake felt oddly cushioned beneath his booted feet, and as if they needed a little extra pressure from him this morning. The storm had evidently messed with the psyches of motor vehicles as well as human beings. Cars lay abandoned, despondent, at odd angles beneath broken windows. And there was a melancholy bus. I'm sorry, and there was a melancholy yellow bus on its side. The main roads had been cleared, however, and the George Washington Bridge had reopened for traffic. There was a gas shortage, but he had hoarded his own supply and reckoned he would be able to cope. Mr. Geronimo was a hoarder of fuel, gas masks, flashlights, blankets, medical supplies, canned food, water in lightweight packets, a man who expected emergencies, who counted on the fabric of society to tear and disintegrate, who knew that superglue could be used to hold cuts together, who did not trust human nature to build solidly or well, a man who expected the worst. Also, a superstitious man, a crosser of fingers who knew, for example, that in America wicked spirits lived in trees, so it was necessary to knock on wood to drive them out. Whereas British tree spirits, he was an admirer of the British countryside, were friendly creatures, so one touched wood to get the benefit of their benevolence. These things were important to know. One couldn't be too careful. If you walk away from God, you should probably try to stay in the good books of luck. He adjusted to the truck's needs and drove up the east side of the island and over the reopened GWB. He had the radio tuned to the oldies station, obviously. Yesterday's gone, the old timers were singing. Good tip, he thought. So it had. And tomorrow never comes, which leaves today. The river had fallen back into its natural course, but all along the banks, Mr. Geronimo saw destruction and black mud, and the drowned past of the city exhumed in the black mud, the funnels of sunken riverboats periscoping through the black mud, the haunted, gap-toothed Oldsmobiles mud crusted on the shore, and darker secrets. The skeleton of the legendary Kipsey River monster and the skulls of murdered Irish longshoremen swimming in the black mud. And there was strange news on the radio too. The ramparts of the Indian fort of Nipponishtan had been razed by the black mud, and the bedraggled furs of ancient Dutch traders and the original casket containing the actual trinkets worth 60 guilders with which a certain Peter Minuit bought an island of hills from the Lenape Indians had been deposited at Inwood Hill Park at the northern tip of Mannahatta, as if the storm was telling our ancestors, fuck you, I'm buying the island back. He made his way down broken, storm littered roads out to La Increnza, the Bliss estate. Mm, that's clever. Okay. Outside the city, the storm had been even wilder. Lightning bolts like immense crooked pillars joined La Increnza to the skies, and order, which Henry James warned was only man's dream of the universe, disintegrated beneath the power of chaos, which was nature's law. Above the gates of the estate, a live wire swung dangerously with death at its tip. When it touched the gates, blue lightning crackled along the bars. The old house stood firm, but the river had burst its banks and risen up like a giant lamprey, all mud and teeth, and swallowed the grounds in a single gulp. It had receded, but left destruction in its wake. Mr. Geronimo, looking at the wreckage, felt that he was present at the death of his imagination, standing at the crime scene of its murder by the thick black mud and the indestructible shit of the past. It may be that he wept. And there, on those formerly rolling lawns, hidden now beneath the black mud and the swollen Hudson, as weeping a little, he surveyed the ruin of more than a decade of his best landscaping work. The stone spirals that echoed the Iron Age Celts, the sunken garden, which put its Floridian cousin in the shade, the Enalima sundial, a replica of the one at the Greenwich Meridian, the rhododendron florist, the Minoan labyrinth, with a fat stone minotaur at its heart, the secret hedge, hidden nooks, all of them lost and broken beneath the black mud of history. The tree roots standing up in the black mud like the arms of drowning men. It was there that Mr. Geronimo understood that his feet had developed a significant new problem. He stepped out onto the mud, and his boots neither squelched nor stuck. He took 2 or 3 bewildered steps across the blackness and looked back and saw that he had left no footprints. "Damn," he cried aloud in consternation. What kind of world had the tempest flung him into? Mr. Geronimo didn't think of himself as being easily scared, but the missing footprints had him spooked. He stamped down hard, left foot, left boot, right boot, left boot. He jumped up and came down as heavily as he could. The mud was unmoved. Had he been drinking? No. Though on occasion he did overdo things as an older man living alone sometimes does, and why not? But this time alcohol was not a factor. Was he still asleep and dreaming of the estate of La Incorenza lost beneath a mud of sea? Maybe, but this didn't feel like a dream. Was this some unworldly river bottom mud? Some river monsterish mud previously unknown to mud scientists whose deep water mystery gave it the power to resist the weight of a leaping man? Or, and this felt the most plausible, though also the most alarming possibility, had there been a change in himself? Some inexplicable personal gravitational lessening? Jesus, he thought, and at once also thought of his father frowning at the blasphemy. His father berating his child self from 2 feet away as if threatening his congregation from his pulpit and his with his weekly fire and brimstone. Jesus, he would really have to get those feet looked at now. Mr. Geronimo was a down-to-earth man, and so it did not occur to him that a new age of the irrational had begun, in which the gravitational aberration to which he had fallen victim would be only one of many autres manifestations. Further bizarreries in his own narrative were beyond his comprehension. It did not enter his mind, for example, that in the near future he might make love to a fairy princess, nor did the transformation of global reality preoccupy him. He drew no broader conclusions from his plight. He did not imagine the imminent reappearance in the oceans of sea monsters large enough to swallow ships in a single gulp, or the emergence of men strong enough to lift fully grown elephants, or the appearance in the skies over the earth of wizards traveling through the air at super speed on magically propelled flying urns. He did not surmise that he could have fallen under the spell of a mighty and malevolent jinn. However, he was methodical by nature, and so, undeniably concerned with his new condition, he reached into a pocket of his battered gardening jacket and found a folded sheet of paper, a bill from the power utility company. The power had been shut down, but the bills continued to insist on prompt settlement. That was the natural order of things. He unfolded the bill and spread it out on the mud. Then he stood on it, stamped and jumped some more, tried to rub the document with his feet. It remained untouched. He reached down and tugged at it, and at once it slid from beneath his feet. No trace of a footprint. He tried a second time and was able to pass the utility bill cleanly under both boots. The gap between himself and the earth was tiny, but unarguable. He was now permanently located at least a sheet of paper's thickness above the planet's surface. Mr. Geronimo straightened with the piece of paper in his hand. Giant trees lay dead around him, sinking into the mud. The lady philosopher, his employer, the fodder heiress, Miss Alexandra Bliss Farina, was watching him through ground floor French windows with tears streaming down her beautiful young face and something else flowing from her eyes that he couldn't make out. It might have been fear or shock. It might even have been desire. Mr. Geronimo's life up to this point had been a journey of a type that was no longer uncommon in our ancestors' peripatetic world, in which people easily became detached from places, beliefs, communities, countries, languages, and even more important things such as honor, morality, good judgment, and truth, in which we may say they splintered away from the authentic narratives of their life stories and spent the rest of their days trying to discover or forge new synthetic narratives of their own. He had been born Rafael Hieronymus Menezes in Bandra, Bombay, the illegitimate son of a firebrand Catholic priest more than 60 summers before the events that concern us now, named on another continent in another age of the world by a man long deceased who had come to seem as alien to him as Martians or reptiles, but was also as close as blood could make him. His holy father, Father Jerry, the very reverend Friar Jeremiah Deniza, was, in his own words, a huge Orson of a man, a whale-sized Moby, unquote, lacking earlobes, but possessing, by way of compensation, the bellow of Stentor, the herald of the Greek army in the war against Troy, whose voice was as strong as 50 men. He was the neighborhood's leading matchmaker and its benevolent tyrant, a conservative of the right type, everyone agreed. Aut Caesar, aut nullus was his personal motto, as it had been Cesare Borgia's, either a Caesar or a nobody. And as Father Jerry was definitely not a nobody, it followed that he must be Caesar. And in fact, so complete was his authority that nobody made a fuss when he surreptitiously, meaning that everyone knew about it, made a match for himself with a grave-faced stenographer, a slip of a thing named Magda Menezes, who looked like a fragile little twig next to the spreading banyan of his father's body. The very Reverend Friar Jeremiah Deniza soon became a little less than perfectly celibate and fathered a fine male child, instantly recognizable as his son by his distinctive ears. For those just joining, we read the first chapter last week. The descendants and children of Dunia, the genie who came to have an affair and live a married life as a woman with the philosopher Ibn Rushd, all have no earlobes and spread around the world, not knowing who they are and sometimes knowing and all that. Okay. Quote: the Pittsburghs and the Denizas are both lobeless, Father Jerry liked to say. Unfortunately, the wrong lot became emperors. The rude street boys of Bandra knew nothing of Habsburgs. They said that Raphael's lack of earlobes was a sign that he was not to be trusted, a sign of insanity, of being an exciting, long word, psychopath. But that was ignorant superstition, obviously. He went to the movies like everyone else and saw that psychopaths, mad killers, mad scientists, mad Mughal princes had perfectly normal ears. Father Jerry's son could not I skipped a page, sorry. Father Jerry's son could not be given his father's surname. Of course, the decencies had to be observed, so he received his mother's instead. For Christian names, the good pastor named him Raphael after the patron saint of Cordoba, Spain, and Hieronymus after Eusebius Sophronius Hieronymus of the city of Stridon, aka Saint Jerome. Raphi, Ronimus, the pastor's sonimus, was he was among the rude boys playing French cricket in Bandra's sainted Catholic streets. Saint Leo, Saint Alexio, Saint Joseph, Saint Andrew, Saint John, Saint Rochas, Saint Sebastian, Saint Martin, until he grew too big and strong to be teased. But to his father, he was always young Raphael Hieronymus Menezes, grandly and in full. He lived with his mother, Magda, in East Bandra, but was permitted to go over to the Tonier West Side on Sundays to sing in his father's church choir and to listen to Father Jerry preach without any apparent awareness of his own hypocrisy about the fiery damnation that was the inevitable consequence of sin. The truth was that Mr. Geronimo in later life had a poor memory, and so much of his childhood was lost. Fragments of his father, however, remained. He remembered singing in church. Mr. Geronimo had a bit of the Latin as a child, as at Christmas in the song bidding, the faithful come in the ancient Roman tongue, Wing his V's as his father commanded. Venite, venite in Bethlehem, natum, videte regum angelorum. But it was Genesis that got him, the Vulgate that was his namesake, St. Jerome's work, Genesis, especially chapter 1, verse 3. Oh, why is it highlighting? Hold on a second. Dixit, Dixitec Deus fiat lux, et facta est lux, translated by himself into his personal Bombay, Woolgate. And God said, cheap Italian motor car, baby soap of the film star. And there was Lux. Please, Daddy, why did God want a small Fiat and a bar of soap? And also, please, why did he get the soap only? Why couldn't he make the car? And why not a better car, Daddy? He could have asked for a Jesus Chrysler, no? Which brought down upon him a predictable Jeremiad from Jeremiah Deniza, plus a thunderous reminder of his wrong side of the blanketness. Don't call me daddy. Call me father like everyone else. And he skipping with a giggle out of reach of the pastor's vengeful hand, singing cheap Italian motor car, beauty soap of the film star. That was his whole childhood right there. He always knew that church wasn't for him, but he liked the songs. And on Sunday, all the local Sandras, there was no comma there, sorry. That was his whole childhood right there. He always knew that church wasn't for him, but he liked the songs. And on Sundays, all the local Sandras came to church, and he liked their flip up hairdos and their cheeky flouncing. Hark the herald angels sing. He taught them at Christmas. Beacom's pills are just the thing. If you want to go to heaven, take a dose of 6 or 7. If you want to go to hell, take the whole damn box as well. The Sandras liked that he let them kiss it. Sorry, I think that messed this up. One moment. The Sandras liked that and let him kiss them secretly on the lips behind the choir stall. His father, so apoplectic in the pulpit, hardly ever hit him, mostly just let his son's mouth run out of blasphemous steam, understanding that bastards have their resentments and must be allowed to air them in whatever form they come out. And after Magda's death, he was a polio victim in those olden days when not everyone had access to the Salk vaccine. He sent Hieronymus to learn a trade from his architect Uncle Charles in the capital of the world, but that didn't work either. Later, when the young man closed the architectural office of Greenwich Avenue and started the gardening business, his father wrote him a letter. You'll never amount to anything if you can't stick to anything. Mr. Geronimo, unstuck in the grounds of La Incorenza, remembered his father's warning. The old man knew what he was talking about. In American mouths, Hieronymus quickly became Geronimo, and he had to admit, the Indian chiefy illusion. It was a big he was a big man like his father, with big, competent hands, a thick neck, and hawkish profile. And with his Indian complexion and all, it was easy for Americans to see the Wild West in him and treat him with a respect reserved for remnants of the peoples exterminated by the white man, which he accepted without clarifying that he was Indian from India and therefore familiar with a quite different history of imperialist oppression. But never mind. Uncle Charles Duniza, he had changed the spelling of his surname, he said, to accommodate Americans' Italianate tastes, also lacked earlobes and had the family gift of height. He was a white-haired and bushy white eyebrows, his fleshy lips habitually stretched in a gentle, disappointed smile, and in his modest architectural practice did not allow politics to be discussed. When he took 22-year-old Geronimo to drink at an inn, run by the Genovese family for drag queens and male hookers and transgendered persons, he wanted to speak only of sex, the love of men and men, which horrified and delighted his Bombay nephew, who had never spoken of such matters before and to whom they had until now remained a mystery. Father Jerry, being a conservative of the right type, considered homosexuality a thing beyond the pale, to be treated as if it did not exist. But now young Geronimo was living in his homosexual uncle's rundown brownstone on St. Mark's Place, and the house was full of Uncle Charles's proteges, half a dozen gay Cuban refugees to whom Charles Duniza, with a lighthearted, dismissive wave of the hand, collectively referred to as the Raouls. The Raouls were to be found in the bathrooms at odd hours, plucking their eyebrows or languidly shaving the body hair off their chests and legs before heading out in search of love. Geronimo Menezes had no idea how to speak to them, but that was okay because they had no interest in speaking to him either. He had always exuded powerful heterosexual pheromones, which induced in the Raouls small mews of indifference that said, "You can coexist in this space with us if you must, but please know that in all essential ways, you don't exist for us at all." As he watched them prance away into the night, Geronimo Menezes found that he envied them their carelessness, the ease with which they had shed Havana like an unwanted snakeskin, navigating this new city with their 10 words of bad English, diving into the polyglot urban sea and feeling instantly at home, or at least adding their easy, brittle, angry, damaged misfittery to all the other square pegs in the round holes all around them, using bathhouse promiscuity to create the feeling of belonging. He wanted to be that way too, he realized. He felt what the Raouls felt. Now that he was here in this broke, dirty, inexhaustible, dangerous, irresistible metropolis, he was never going home. Like so many unbelievers, Geronimo Menezes was looking for paradise, but Manhattan Island then was anything but Edenic. After the riots that summer, Uncle Charles gave up the Mafia Inn. A year later, he would march with the Pride Marchers, but uncomfortably. He wasn't a natural protester. Reading Voltaire's Candide, he declared himself in agreement with the book's much abused hero. Il faut cultiver son jardin. Stay home, go to work, attend to business. Right? Attend your own garden. Okay. He advised his nephew Geronimo, this solitary come activism thing, I don't know. He was cautious by nature, a member of an association of gay business people, which, as Charles Duniza took pride in saying for years afterwards, had been addressed by Ed Koch. Is it this is the billionaire guy, right? Ed Koch. Is it Koch or Coach? Koch. I don't know. By the famous dude, right? When he was on the city council, it was the first openly gay organization he spoke to, and everyone had been too courteous to ask the future mayor anything about his own rumored sexual orientation. Oh, okay, I know. Right. Charles was a regular attendee of the association's silk and tie gatherings in the village, and in his own way, a conservative like his brother, Father Jerry, back home. But when the call came to march, he put on his Sunday best and joined the wild parade, one of the few formally dressed persons in that defiant carnival of self assertion. And Geronimo, straight as he was, went with him. By now, they were fast friends, and it wouldn't have been right to let Uncle Charles go into battle alone. The years passed, and the architectural practice began to struggle. The walls of the Greenwich Avenue office were lined with dreams, buildings Charles Duniza had never built and would never build. In the late 1980s, his friend, the celebrated real estate developer Bento V. Elfenbein, bought 100 acres of prime property in Big Groundnut on the South Fork of Long Island. Its name was taken from the Pequot Indian word, later more usually translated as potato, and wanted 100 architects to build signature homes on an acre each. One of these acres was promised to Charles. Of course you, Charles. What do you think? I don't remember my friends? Bento expostulated. But the project remained in the doldrums because of complex financing issues, until Charles's smile faded a little, became a little sadder. Bento, a dandy with rakishly floppy brown hair and a colorful relationship with cravats, came across as absurdly glamorous and almost shockingly charming. The scion of a big Hollywood dynasty. He was flamboyantly intellectual with a tendency to quote Veblen's theory of the leisure class with a bitter irony leavened somewhat by his own indefatigable Hollywood grin, a Joe E. Brown dazzler full of big, bright white teeth inherited from a mother who had been on the screen with Chaplin. The leisure class, the leisure class, aka the landed gentry, on whom my business depends, he told Geronimo Menezes, are the hunters, not the gatherers. They make their way by the immoral road of exploitation, not the virtuous path of industry. But I, to make my way, have to treat the rich as the good guys, the lions, the creators of wealth and guardians of freedom, which naturally I don't mind doing because I'm an exploiter too, and I also want to think of myself as virtuous. Bento was proud to bear one version of the first name of the philosopher Spinoza. In a translate in a translation of myself, he liked to say, I would be Baruch Ivory. Maybe if I'd stayed in the motion picture business, that would have been a better handle. Be that as it may, here in New Amsterdam, I'm proud to be named after Benedito de Spinoza, Portuguese Jew of Amsterdam the Older. From him, I take my famous rationalism. Also, my knowledge that mind and body are one, and Descartes was wrong to separate them. Forget the soul. No such ghost in the machine. What happens to our mind befalls our body also. The condition of the body is also the state of the mind. Remember this. Spinoza said God had a body too. God's mind and body were one, just like ours. For this type of iconoclastic thinking, they flung him out of Jewish society. They issued against him in Amsterdam an excommunicating cherem. The Catholics took the hint, put his immortal ethics on their index librorum prohibi- prohiborum, prohibitorum, which doesn't mean he wasn't right. He, in his turn, was inspired by the Andalusian Arab Averroes. That's the English name for Ibn Rushd, by the way, who was given a pretty rough ride too, which also didn't mean he was wrong. In my opinion, by the way, Spinoza's theory of mind body union applies equally to nation states, he goes on. The body politic and the ones in the control room are not separate from one another. You remember that Woody Allen movie with the operatives in the brain sending the sperm to the white outfits and hoodies to work when the body is about to get laid, same kind of thing. Bento owned a building on Park Avenue South and lunched most days in the oak paneled restaurant on its ground floor. Here, he sometimes invited Geronimo Menezes to talk about the real facts of life. A person like yourself, he said, uprooted, not yet rerooted, is what my favorite Thorstein V called an alien of the uneasy feet, a disturber of the intellectual peace, but only at the cost of becoming an intellectual wayfaring man, a wanderer in the intellectual no man's land, seeking another place to rest farther along the road, somewhere over the horizon. Does that sound like you to you? Or are you, as I'm guessing you are, seeking that resting place closer to home, not over the rainbow, but in the company of, to be frank, my beautiful daughter? Is Ella what you're looking for to stop you floating away? your anchor. Is that what you want her to be for you? The one who makes your feet feel easy? She's a kid, 21 last March. You're close to 14 years her senior. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm a man of the world. And anyway, my princess usually gets what she wants, so let's leave it to her to decide, okay? Geronimo Menezes nodded, not knowing what else to do. So, Ganung, Elfenbein said, smiling his Beverly Hills smile, try the Dover sole. That winter, Uncle Charles suddenly announced he wanted to make a trip back to India and took Geronimo with him. After the long years away, their hometown was a shock to the eyes, as if an alien city, Mumbai, had descended from space and settled on top of the Bombay they remembered. But something of Bandra had survived, its spirit as well as its buildings, and Father Jerry, too, still going strong at 80, still surrounded by the adoring women of his congregation, though probably incapable of doing much about it. The old priest's mood had darkened with the passing years. His weight had dropped, his voice weakened. He had become, in many ways, a smaller man. I am happy, Raphael, to have lived in my time and not in this one, he said over Chinese food. In my time, nobody ever dared say I was not a true Bombayite or a Puka Indian. Now they say it. Geronimo Menezes, hearing his original given name after so long, felt a pang of a feeling he recognized as alienation, the sensation of not belonging anymore to a part of oneself. And he understood also that Father Jerry, shoveling chicken chow mein into his face as if it were the Last Supper, felt similarly alienated, comparably unnamed. In the new Mumbai, after a lifetime service, he was newly inauthentic, excluded by the rise of extremist uh, Hindutva ideology, from full membership of his country, from his city, from himself. I tell you a family story now I never told you before, Father Jerry said. I did not tell you because I thought, in my error, you were not truly a part of the family, and for this I ask your pardon. For Father Jerry to ask for forgiveness was a thunderbolt, a further indication that the place to which Geronimo Menezes had returned was no longer the place young Rafael Menezes had left so many years ago. While the hitherto untold family story sounded to Geronimo Menezes' Americanized ear pretty garbled and irrelevant, a tale of ancient rumored origins in 12th century Spain of conversions, expulsions, intermarriages, wanderings, illegitimate children, jinn, a mythical matriarch called Dunia, a baby factory who might have been Shehrazad's sister, or maybe a genie without a bottle to pop or a lamp to rub, and a philosopher's patriarch, Averroes. Father Jerry used the westernized version of Ibn Rushd's name and unwittingly conjured up before Geronimo's mind's eye the face of Bento Elfenbein, quoting Spinoza. I have little truck with Averroism, a deviant school of thought descended from the Priap- Priapic doctor of Cordoba, Father Jerry growled, thumping the table with a little of his old fervor. Even in the Middle Ages, it was considered a synonym for atheism. But in the story of Dunia, the fertile, maybe genie with the dark brown hair is true. If the Cordoban indeed planted his seed in that garden, then we are his bastard brood, the Dunia Zat, from which maybe down the centuries emerged our garbled Deniza. And the curse he laid upon us all is our destiny and our doom. The curse of being out of step with God, ahead of our time or behind it, who can say, of being weathercocks, showing how the wind blows, coal mine canaries, perishing to prove the air is poisonous, or lightning rods through whom the storm strikes first. Of being the chosen people God smashes with his fist to make an example of whenever he wants to make a point. So I'm being told at this point in my life that it's okay to be my father's illegitimate son because we are all a wrong side of the blanket tribe of bastards, Geronimo Menezes thought, and wondered if this too was part of the old man's idea of an apology. He found it hard to take the story seriously or to care about it very much. If the story is true, he said, making conversation to be polite, to conceal his lack of interest in this old time folderol, we are a little bit of everything, right? Ju- Jew, Jewslim Christians, patchwork types. Father Jerry's heavy brow furrowed deeply. Being a little bit of everything was the Bombay way, he muttered. But it is out of fashion. The narrow mind replaces the wide skirt. Majority rules and minority look out. So we become outsiders in our own place. And when trouble comes, and trouble is coming for sure, outsiders have a habit of getting it in the neck before anyone else. By the way, Uncle Charles said the reason you never heard the family fairy tale from him is that he didn't want to admit his Jewish origins, or maybe his genie origins, because genies don't exist, do they? And if they do, they come from the devil, am I right? And the reason you didn't hear it from me is that I forgot it years ago. My sexual orientation provided all the outsiderness I needed. Father Jerry glared at his brother. I always thought, he said furiously, you should have been beaten harder as a child to thrash the buggery out of you. Charles Duniza pointed a noodle wrapped fork at the priest. I used to pretend to myself that he was joking when he came out with stuff like this, he told Geronimo. Now I can't pretend anymore. Lunch ended in a stiff, bad tempered silence. Chosen people, Geronimo thought. I've heard that term before. Geronimo Menezes, walking his formerly beloved streets, realized that something had broken. When he left Mumbai a few days later, he knew he would not return. He traveled the country with Uncle Charles looking at buildings. They visited the home built by Le Corbusier in Gujarat for the monarch of the textile dynasty. The house was cool and airy, protected by brise soleil structures from the excesses of the sun. But it was the garden that spoke to Geronimo. It seemed to be clawing at the house, snaking its way inside, trying to destroy the barriers that separated exterior space from interior. In the upper regions of the house, flowers and grass successfully surmounted its walls, and the floor became a lawn. He left that place knowing he no longer wanted to be an architect. Uncle Charles went south to Goa, but Geronimo Menezes made his way to Kyoto in Japan and sat at the feet of the great horticulturalist Ryonosuke Shimura, who taught him that the garden was the outward expression of inner truth, the place where the dreams of our childhoods collided with the archetypes of our cultures and created beauty. The place where the dreams of our childhoods collided with the archetypes of our cultures and created beauty. The land might belong to the landowner, but the garden belongs to the gardener. This was the power of the horticultural art. Il faut cultiver son jardin. Didn't sound so quietist when viewed through Shimura's vision. But he had been named Hieronymus and knew from the great painter, who was his mighty namesake, that a garden could also be a metaphor of the infernal. In the end, both Bosch's terrifying earthly delights and Shimura's murmurous mysticism helped him formulate his own thoughts, and he came to see the garden and his work in it as somehow Blockian, a marriage of heaven and hell. After the Indian trip, Uncle Charles announced his decision to bring a small nest egg back to Goa and retire. He had bought a simple cottage there and put up for sale the brownstone in St. Mark's, and the Raouls of the 1970s were long gone. The proceeds would take care of his old age. As to the practice, it's yours if you want it, he told Geronimo, who, for perhaps the first time in his life, knew exactly what he did want. He took over the Greenwich Avenue office and, with a little financial help from Bento Elfenbein, reconstituted it reconstituted it as a gardening landscaping service, Geronimo Gardner, to which Bento's treasured daughter Ella added the Mister that made it sing. That brought him into the fullness of his new American identity. Mr. Geronimo, he was to everyone from then on. I remember the second chapter of this book being very long, and I have no idea how much longer it goes, so give me a moment. We must be about halfway through. Okay. I think we might stop there. I'm so sorry to have to stop in the middle of the chapter, but we should at least take a break. Where did we leave off here? From then on. Okay. Let's just take a breather for a moment. We don't need that light any longer. Excusez-moi. All right. Young Ella Elfenbein, of course, was what he really wanted. And unaccountably, she wanted him too. Motherless Ella, who had no memory of Raquel Elfenbein, lost to cancer when Ella was just 2, but who was, for her father, her mother's very image and reincarnation. It was Ella's mysteriously unshakable love for Mr. Geronimo, whom, as she liked to say, she had after all partly invented, that led Bento to invest in the man she was going to marry. Ella was an olive-skinned beauty, her chin slightly too prominent, her ears oddly the same as his own, a little lacking in the lobes, and their maxillary central incisors a little too vampirishly long, but Mr. Geronimo wasn't complaining. He knew he was a lucky man. If he believed in souls, he would have said she had a good one, and he knew from the stories she couldn't help telling him how many men hit on her on a daily basis. But her loyalty to him was as unswerving as it was mysterious. She was, additionally, the most positive spirit Mr. Geronimo had ever encountered. She didn't like books with unhappy endings. Faced every day with her life of joy and believed, I'm sorry, faced every day of her life with joy and believed that all reverses could be turned to one's advantage. She accepted the idea that positive thinking could help cure diseases, whereas anger made you sick. And one day, searching idly through Sunday morning TV, she heard a televangelist say, God prospers the faithful. He's going to give you whatever you want. All you have to do is truly want it. And Mr. Geronimo heard her murmur under her breath, That's true. She believed in God as firmly as she hated gefilte fish. She didn't think men descended from monkeys, and she knew, she told him, that there was a heaven where she was going eventually, and also a hell where unfortunately he was probably bound, except that she was going to save him so that he could have a happy ending too. He decided he would find all this not alien, but delightful, and their marriage was good. The years ran on. They had no children. Ella was barren. Maybe that was why she loved the idea of his being a gardener. At least there were some seeds he could plant and watch their flowers grow. He told her in his black comic way about lonely men in remote localities who fucked the earth, who made a hole in the soil and planted their own seed there to see if man plants would grow, half human, half vegetal. But she made him stop. She didn't like stories like that. "Why don't you tell me happy stories?" she scolded him. "That wasn't nice." He hung his head in mock apology, and she forgave him. Nothing mock about her forgiveness. She meant it, as she meant everything she said or did. The years ran on some more. The troubled Father Jerry had predict the trouble Father Jerry had predicted came to Bombay, which had become Mumbai, and there was a December and January of communal rioting during which 900 people died, mostly Muslims and Hindus. But according to the official account, there were also 45 unknown and 5 others. Charles Duniza had come to Mumbai from Goa to visit the Kamathipura red light district in search of Manjula, his favorite Hijra sex worker, to use the new morally neutral term, to use the I'm sorry, Hijra sex worker, to use the new morally neutral term, and found death instead of sex work. A mob angered by the destruction of Ayodhya of the Mughal Emperor Babar's mosque ran through the streets, and perhaps the first victims of the Hindu-Muslim troubles were a Christian other and his transgender whore, an other of another kind. Nobody cared. Father Jerry was off his turf at the Minara Mosque in the Pidhoni district, trying, as a third party, neither Muslim nor Hindu, to use his long eminence in the city to calm the passions of the faithful. But he was told to leave, and maybe somebody followed him, somebody with murder in mind, and Father Jerry never got home to Bandra. After that, there were 2 waves of killings, and Charles and Father Jerry became insignificant statistics. The city, which once prided itself on being above communal troubles, was above them no longer. Bombay was gone, dying in the very Reverend Friar Jeremiah Deniza. All that remained was the new, uglier Mumbai. "You're all I have now," Geronimo Menezes told Ella when the news about his uncle and father reached him. Then Bento Elfenbein died, struck by lightning out of a clear night sky while she was smoking an after dinner cigar on his beloved 100 acres of big groundnut after a jovial dinner with good friends, and it emerged that his entrepreneurial dealings had led him to the edge of ruin. He had been involved in a lot of funny business, not actual Ponzi schemes, but similar smoke and mirrors con games, home improvement, and office supply scams, a Max B- BLE stock type movie production swindle that gave him intense pleasure. Who'd have thought, he had written in an incriminating notebook found hidden in his bedroom after his passing, that springtime for Hitler idea would actually work in real life. There was at least one giant pyramid con in the Midwest, and his whole operation was so heavily leveraged that immediately after his death, the Elfenbein House of Cards went tumbling into the humiliation of seizures and foreclosures. The groundnut acres were forfeited, and not one of Bento's dream houses was ever built. If Elfenbein had lived, he would have done jail time, Mr. Geronimo realized. The authorities were on Bento's trail for tax fraud and a dozen other infractions, and they were closing in. The bolt from the blue gave him a dignified exit, or rather, one as flamboyant as his life. "Now," said Ella, who inherited what she described as next to nothing, "you're all I have, too." As he took her into his arms, he felt a tremor of superstition shake his body. He remembered Father Jerry talking at that strained Chinese lunch about Ibn Rushd's household being cursed by God to be lightning rods or examples. Was it possible, he wondered, that those families who were joined to his family by marriage fell under the curse as well? Stop it, he admonished himself. You don't believe in medieval curses or in God. This, when she was 30 and he 40, she made him a happy man. Mr. Geronimo, the contented gardener. His weathered days spread out in the open like mysteries revealed, his spade trowel, shears, and gloves speaking the language of living things as eloquently as any writer's pen. In flower pinking, the earth in spring or fighting winter ice. Perhaps it is in the nature of workers to translate themselves into what they work upon, the way dog lovers come to look like their dogs. So perhaps Mr. Geronimo's little foible was not so peculiar after all, but often, if truth be told, he preferred to think of himself as a plant, perhaps even as one of those man plants born of sexual congress between a human being and the earth. And consequently, as the garden as the gardened rather than the gardener, he placed himself in the soil of time and wondered godlessly, who might be gardening him? In these imaginings, he cast himself always among the rootless plants, the epiphytes and bryophytes, who must lean upon others, being unable to stand alone. So he was, in his own fancy, a sort of moss or lichen or creeping orchid, and the one he leaned upon, the gardener of his non existent soul, was Ella Menezes, his loving and much loved wife. Sometimes sometimes when they made love, she told him he smelled like smoke. Sometimes, she said, it was as if in the throes of his passion, the edges of his body softened, became blurry, so that her body could melt into his. He told her he burned garden refuse every day. He told her she was imagining things. Neither of them suspected the truth. Then, 7 years after Bento's death, lightning struck again. The 1,001-acre La Incorenza property had been named by a man dedicated to numbers who believed that the world didn't add up. Mr. Sanford Bliss, the animal feed king, producer of the famous Bliss chows for pigs, rabbits, cats, dogs, horses, cattle, and monkeys. It was said of Sanford Bliss that there wasn't a line of poetry in his head, but every dollar figure he'd ever encountered was neatly filed away and readily accessible. He believed in cash. And in the great vault in his library, concealed behind a portrait painted in the Florentine manner depicting him as a Tuscan grandee, he stored always an almost comical amount of cash money, well over $1 million in bricks of notes of different denominations, because, as he said, you never know. He also believed in numerical superstitions, such as the idea that round numbers were unlucky. You never charged $10 for a bag of feed, you charged $9.99. And you never made a man a $100 tip, but always 101. You never gave a man a $100 tip, but always 101. When he was a college student, he spent a summer in Florence as the guest of the Actons of La Pietra, and at their dinner table, in the company of artists and thinkers for whom numbers were meaningless or at best common and therefore beneath consideration, he encountered the extraordinarily un-American idea that reality was not something given, not an absolute, but something that men made up, and that values too changed according to who was doing the valuing. A world that did not cohere, in which truth did not exist and was replaced by warring versions trying to dominate or even eradicate their rivals, horrified him and, being bad for business, struck him as a thing that needed altering. He named his home La Incoerenza, incoherence in Italian, to remind him daily of what he had learned in Italy, and spent a sizable portion of his wealth promoting those politicians who held, usually because of genuine or fake religious convictions, that the eternal certainties needed protecting and that monopolies of goods, information, and ideas were not only beneficial, but essential to the preservation of human liberty. I'm sorry, of American liberty. In spite of his efforts, the world's incompatibility levels in spite of his efforts, the world's incompatibility levels, what Sanford Bliss in his numerical way came to call its index of incoherence, continued inexorably to rise. Quote, if zero is the point of sanity, at which two plus two always equals four, and one is the fucked up place where two and two can add up to any damn thing you want them to be, he told his daughter, Alexandra, the adored child of his old age, born to his last, much more youthful Siberian wife long after he had given up the dream of an heir. Then, Sandy, I'm sorry to tell you that we are currently located somewhere around 0.973. When her parents suddenly died, when they fell out of the sky into the East River, the arbitrariness of their end, finally proving to Sanford Bliss's daughter Alexandra that the universe was not only incoherent and absurd, but also heartless and soulless, the young orphan inherited everything. And having neither business acumen nor entrepreneurial interest, he immediately negotiated the sale of the Bliss chows to the Land O'Lakes Agricultural Cooperative of Minnesota, thus becoming at 19 years of age America's youngest billionairess. She completed her studies at Harvard, where she revealed an exceptional gift for the acquisition of languages, becoming fluent by the end of her time at the university in French, German, Italian, Spanish, Dutch, Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, Swedish, Finnish, Hungarian, Cantonese, Mandarin, Russian, Pashto, Farsi, Arabic, and Tagalog. She picked them up in no time, people said in wonderment, like shiny pebbles on a beach. And she picked up a man, too, the usual penniless Argentine polo player, a healthy slice of beef from the estancias named Manuel Farinha, picked up him picked him up and dropped him fast, married and quickly divorced. She kept his name, turned vegetarian, and sent him packing. After the divorce, she retreated forever into the seclusion of La Incorenza. Here, she began her long inquiry into pessimism, inspired by both Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, and convinced and convinced of the absurdity of human life and the incompatibility of happiness and freedom, settled while still in the first bloom of youth into a lifetime of solitude and gloom, cloistered in abstraction and dressed in close-fitting white lace. Ella Elfenbein Menezes referred to her with more than a little scorn as the lady philosopher, and the name stuck, at least in Mr. Geronimo's head. There was a streak of masochistic stoicism in the lady philosopher, and in bad weather she was often to be found out of doors, ignoring the wind and drizzle, or rather accepting them as truthful representations of the growing hostility of the earth towards its occupants, sitting under an old spreading oak, reading a damp book by Unamuno or Camus. The rich are obscure to us, finding ways to be unhappy when all the normal causes of unhappiness are removed. But unhappiness had touched the lady philosopher. Her parents were killed in their private helicopter. An elite death, but at the moment of dying, we are all penniless. She never spoke of it. It would be generous to understand her behavior, willful, remote, abstract, as her way of expressing grief. The Hudson, at the end of its journey, is a drowned river, its fresh water pushed beneath the incoming salt tides of the sea. Quote, even the goddamn river makes no sense, Sanford Bliss told his daughter. Look how often it flows the wrong goddamn way. The Indians had called it Chateaumook, the river that flows both ways. on the banks of the drowned river La Incorenza likewise resisted order. Mr. Geronimo was called in to help. His reputation as a gardener and landscape artist had grown, and he was recommended to her manager, and an avuncular British grizzle chops named Oliver Oldcastle, and the beard of Karl Marx, a voice like a bassoon, a drink problem, and a Father Jerry style Catholic upbringing that had left him loving the Bible and loathing the church. Oldcastle ushered Mr. Geronimo into the grounds, looking like God showing Adam into Eden, and charged him with the task of bringing horticultural coherence to the place. When Mr. Geronimo started working for the lady philosopher, tangles of thorns filled the ha at the bottom of the garden, as if surrounding a sleeping beauty's castle. Obstinate voles burrowed underground and popped up everywhere, ruining the lawns. Foxes raided the chicken coops. If Mr. Geronimo had run into a snake coiled around a branch of a tree, around a branch of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he wouldn't have been surprised. The lady philosopher shrugged delicately at the state of things. She was barely 20 then, but already spoke with the pitiless formality of a dowager. To bring a country place to heal, the orphan chatelaine of La Incorenza stiffly said, one must kill and kill and kill. One must destroy and destroy. Only after years of mayhem can a measure of stable beauty be achieved. This is the meaning of civilization. Your eyes, however, are soft. I fear you may not be the murderer I need, but anyone else would probably be just as bad. Because of her belief in the growing weakness and increasing incompetence of the human race in general, she agreed to put up with Mr. Geronimo and suffer with a sigh the consequent imperfections of her land. She retreated into thought and left Mr. Geronimo to the war of the thorns and voles. His failures went unnoticed. His successes earned him no praise. A deadly oak a deadly oak blight struck the region, threatening Alexandra's beloved trees. He followed the example of scientists on the country's far western coast who were coating or injecting oaks with a commercial fungicide that kept the fatal pathogen Phytophthora ramorum at bay. When he told hi- when he told his employer that the treatment had succeeded and all her oaks were saved, she shrugged and turned away as if to say something else will kill them soon enough. Ella Menezes and the lady philosopher, both young, smart, and beautiful, could have become friends, but did not. What Ella called Alexandra's negativity, her insistence, when challenged by the ever hopeful Ella that it was impossible at this point in history to adopt a hopeful view of humanity, drove them apart. Ella sometimes accompanied Mr. Geronimo to La Incorenza and walked the grounds while he worked, or stood atop the estate's single green hill watching the river pass by in the wrong direction. And it was on that hill, 7 years after her father died, that she too was hit by lightning out of a clear sky and died on the spot. Among the many aspects of her death that Mr. Geronimo found unbearable was this: that of the two beauties at La Incorenza that day, the lightning had singled out the optimist for death and had let the pessimist live. The phenomenon, colloquially known as a bolt from the blue, words like this: the lightning flash emanates from the rear of a thundercloud and travels as many as 25 miles away from the storm sea, then angles down and strikes the ground, or a tall building, or a lone tree in a high place, or a woman standing alone on a hilltop watching the river pass by. The storm from which it came is too far away to be seen, but the woman on the hilltop can be seen, falling slowly to the ground like a feather, complying very reluctantly with the law of gravity. Mr. Geronimo thought of her dark eyes, the right eye with its floaters that hampered her sight. He conjured up her talkativeness, thinking of how she always had an opinion about everything, and wondering what he would do without her opinions now. He remembered how she hated to be photographed and listed in his thoughts all the foods she wouldn't eat: meat, fish, eggs, dairy, tomatoes, onions, garlic, gluten, almost everything there was. And he wondered again if lightning was striking his family or was stalking his family. And if, by marrying into that family, Ella had called down the curse upon herself, and if he might be next in line. In the weeks that followed, he began to study lightning as never before. When he learned that 9/10ths of the people who were struck by lightning survived, sometimes developing mysterious ailments but managing to live on, he understood that lightning really had it in for Bento and his girl. Lightning wasn't letting them off the hook. Maybe it was because he had convinced himself that he wouldn't stand a chance if lightning ever came for him, that even after he was caught in the great storm that first day, even after he discovered that his feet were suffering from the mysterious ailment of refusing to touch the ground, it took him a long time to think the obvious thought. Maybe lightning hit me during the hurricane and I lived, but it wiped my memory clean so I don't remember being didn't remember being hit. And maybe I'm now carrying around some sort of insane electric charge, and that's why I've lifted off the surface of the earth. He didn't think that until quite a while later, when Alexandra Farinha suggested it. He asked the lady philosopher if he might bury his wife on her beloved green hill overlooking the drowned river, and Alexandra said yes, of course. So he dug his wife's grave and laid her in it, and for a moment he was angry. Then there was an end to anger, and he shouldered his shovel and went home alone. On the day his wife died, he had worked at La Incorenza for 2 years, 8 months, and 28 days. 1,000 days and 1 day. There was no escape from the curse of numbers. 10 more years passed. Mr. Geronimo dug and planted and watered and pruned. He gave life and saved it. In his mind, every bloom was her, every hedge and every tree. In his work, he kept her alive, and there was no room for anyone else. But slowly she faded. His plants and trees resumed their membership of the vegetable kingdom and ceased to be her avatars. It was as though she had left him again. After this second departure, there was only emptiness, and he was certain the void could never be filled. For 10 years, he lived in a sort of blur. The lady philosopher, wrapped as she was in theories, dedicated to the triumph of the worst case scenario while eating truffled pasta and breaded veal, her head full of the mathematical formulae that provided the scientific basis for her pessimism, became herself a sort of abstraction, his chief source of income and no more. It continued to be difficult not to blame her for being the one who lived, who survived at the cost of his wife's life, had not persuaded her to be grateful for her good luck and brighten her attitude to life. He looked at the land and at what grew upon it, and could not raise his eyes to absorb the human being whose land it was. For 10 years after his wife died, he kept his distance from the lady philosopher, nursing his secret anger. After that time, if you had asked him what Alexandra Bliss Farinha looked like, he would have been unable to answer with any precision. Her hair was dark, like his late wife's. She was tall, like his late wife. She didn't like sitting in sunlight, nor had Ella. It was said she walked her grounds at night because of her lifelong battle with insomnia. Her other employees, manager Oldcastle and the rest, spoke of the persistent health problems that perhaps caused or at least contributed to her air of profound gloom. So young and so often sick, Oldcastle said. He used the antique word consumption, tuberculosis, the sickness of little tubers. The potato is a tuber, and they're in flowers like dahlias. whose fleshy roots, properly called rhizomes, are known as tubers too. Mr. Geronimo had no expertise in the tubercles that formed in human lungs. Those were issues for the house to deal with. He was out in the open. The plants he tended contained the spirit of his deceased wife. The lady philosopher was a phantom, though she, and not Ella, was the one who was still alive. Alexandra never published under her own name or in the English language. Her pseudonym of choice was L. Criticon, taken from the title of the 17th century allegorical novel by Balthazar Gracian, which had greatly influenced her idol Schopenhauer, greatest of all pessimist thinkers. The novel was about the impossibility of human happiness. In a much derided Spanish language essay, The Worst of All Possible Worlds, Criticon proposed the theory, widely ridiculed as sentimental, that the rift between the human race and the planet was approaching a tipping point, an ecological crisis that was metamorphosing into an existential one. Her academic peers patted her on the head, congratulated her on her command of Castellano, and dismissed her as an amateur. But after the time of the strangenesses, she would be seen as a kind of prophetess. Mr. Geronimo thought Alexandra Farina's use of pseudonyms in foreign languages indicated an uncertainty about the self. Mr. Geronimo, too, suffered from his own kind of ontological insecurity. At night alone, he looked at the face in the mirror and tried to see the younger chorister, Raffi Ronimus, the pastor's sonimus, there struggling to imagine the path not taken, the life not led, the other fork in the forked path of life. He could no longer imagine it. Sometimes he filled up with a kind of rage, the fury of the uprooted and untribed. But mostly he no longer thought in tribal terms. The indolence of her days, the delicacy of her china, the elegance of her high-necked lace dresses, the amplitude of her estate and her carelessness regarding its condition, her fondness for marrons glacés and Turkish delight, the leather-bound aristocracy of her library and the floral-patterned prettiness of the journals in which she made her almost military assault on the possibility of joy should have hinted to her why she was not taken seriously beyond the walls of La Incurrenza. But her small world was enough for her. She cared nothing for the opinions of strangers. Reason could not and would never triumph over savage, undimmed unreason. The heat death of the universe was inevitable. Her glass of water was half empty. Things fell apart. The only proper response to the failure of optimism was to retreat behind high walls, walls in the self as well as in the world, to await the inevitability of death. Voltaire's fictional optimist, Dr. Pangloss, was, after all, a fool, and his real life mentor, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, was in the first place a failure as an alchemist. In Nuremberg, he had not managed to transmute base metal into gold, and in the second place, a plagiarist. The damaging accusations leveled at Leibniz by associates of Sir Isaac Newton that he, G. W. Leibniz, inventor of the infinitesimal calculus, had sneaked a look at Newton's work on the subject and pinched the Englishman's ideas. If the best of all possible worlds, if the best of all possible worlds is one in which another thinker's ideas can be purloined, she wrote, then perhaps it would be better after all to accept the advice of Candide and withdraw to cultivate one's own garden or one's garden. Okay. She did not cultivate her garden. She employed a gardener. It was a long time since Mr. Geronimo had considered sex, but recently he had to confess the subject had begun to cross his thoughts again. At his age, such thinking veered towards the theoretical, the practical business of finding and conjoining with an actual partner being, given the inelectable law of tempus fugit, a thing of the past. He hypothesized that there were more than two sexes, that in fact each human being was a gender unique to himself or herself, so that maybe new personal pronouns were required, better words than he or she. Obviously, it was entirely inappropriate. Amid the infinity of sexes, there were a very few sexes with which one could have Congress, who wished to join one in Congress. And with some of those sexes, one was briefly compatible, or compatible for a reasonable length of time before the process of rejection began, as it does in transplanted hearts or livers. In very rare cases, one found the other sex with whom one was compatible for life, permanently compatible, as if the two sexes were the same, which perhaps, according to this new definition, they were. Once in his life, he had found that perfect gender, and the odds against doing so again were prohibitive. Not that he was looking, not that he ever would, but here, now, in the aftermath of the storm, as he stood on the sea of mud full of the indestructible shit of the past, or to be precise, as he somehow failed to stand on that sea, hovering just a fraction above it, just high enough to allow a sheet of paper to pass without difficulty under his boots. Now, as he wept for the death of his imagination and was filled with fears and doubts on account of the failure of gravity in his immediate vicinity, at this absolutely inappropriate moment, here was his employer, the lady philosopher, the fodder heiress Alexandra Bliss Farinia, beckoning to him from her French windows. Mr. Geronimo, arriving at the French windows, noted the estate manager Oliver Oldcastle positioned behind Alexandra's left shoulder. If he had been a hawk, thought Mr. Geronimo, he would have perched upon that shoulder, ready to attack his mistress's foes and rip their hearts out of their chests. Mistress and servant stood together, surveying the ruin of La Incorenza. Oliver Oldcastle, looking like Marx observing the fall of communism, Alexandra, her customary enigmatic self, in spite of the drying tears on her cheeks. I can't complain, she said, addressing neither Mr. Geronimo nor Manager Oldcastle, rebuking herself as if she were her own governess. People have lost their homes and have nothing to eat and nowhere to sleep. All I have lost is a garden. Mr. Geronimo the gardener understood that he was being put in his place. But Alexandra was looking at his boots now. It's a miracle, she said. Look, Oldcastle, a real miracle. Mr. Geronimo has taken leave of solid ground and moved upwards into, let us say, more speculative territory. Mr. Geronimo wanted to protest that his levitation was neither his doing nor his choice, to make it plain that he would be happy to subside to the ground again and get his boots dirty. But Alexandra had a glitter in her eye. Were you struck by lightning? She asked. Yes, that's it. Lightning hit you during the hurricane and you lived, but it wiped your memory clean, so you don't remember being hit. And now you're filled with an unspeakably large electric charge, and that's why you've lifted off the surface of the earth. This silenced Mr. Geronimo, who considered it gravely. Yes, perhaps, though in the absence of any evidence, it was no more than a supposition. He found it difficult to know what to say, but there was nothing he needed to say. Here's another miracle, Alexandra said, and her voice was different now, no longer imperious, but confidential. For most of my life, I have set aside the possibility of love. And then, just now, I realized that it was waiting for me right here at home, outside my French windows, stamping its boots towards the mud, but untouched by that evil filth. Then she turned and vanished into the shadows of the house. He feared a trap. Appointments of this sort were not on his schedule anymore. Never had been, really. Manager Oldcastle jerked his head, ordering him to follow the lady of the house. So Mr. Geronimo understood that he had his orders and moved indoors, not knowing where the lady of the house had gone. but he followed the trail of her discarded clothing and found her easily enough. His night with Alexandra Bliss Farinha began strangely. Whatever force was preventing him from touching the ground was also at work in her bed. And when she lay beneath him, his body hovered above hers just a fraction of an inch above, but there was a definite separation that made things awkward. He tried placing his hands beneath her buttocks and lifting her towards him, but that was uncomfortable for them both. They solved the problem soon enough. If he was beneath her, then things worked well enough, even if his back didn't quite touch the bed. His condition seemed to arouse her, and that in turn excited him. But the moment their lovemaking was over, she appeared to lose interest and swiftly fell asleep, leaving him to stare at the ceiling in the dark. And when he got out of bed to dress and leave, the gap between his feet and the floor was distinctly greater. After his night with the mistress of La Incorenza, he had lifted almost a full inch off the ground. He left her bedchamber to find Oldcastle outside with murder in his eyes. "Don't imagine you're the first," the manager told Mr. Geronimo. "Don't imagine that at your ridiculous age you are the only love she has ever found waiting right outside her window. You pathetic old fungus. You sickening parasite. You growth, you blunted thorn, you bad seed. Get out and don't come back." Mr. Geronimo understood at once that Oliver Oldcastle had been driven mad by unrequited love. "My wife is buried on that hill," he said firmly, "and I will visit her grave whenever I choose. You will have to kill me to stop me, unless I kill you first." "Your marriage ended last night in Milady's bedchamber," retorted Oliver Oldcastle. "And as to which of us kills the other, that bloomin' remains to be seen." There had been fires and buildings our ancestors had known all their lives stood charred among them, staring into the pitiless brightness through the hollow sockets of their blackened eyes like the undead on TV. As our ancestors emerged from their places of safety and lurched through the orphaned streets, the storm began to feel like their fault. There were preachers on television calling it God's punishment for their licentious ways, but that was not the point. It did feel, at least to some of them, that something they had made had escaped their grasp and freed had raged around them for days. When the earth, air, and water calmed down, they feared that forces returned. They feared that forces return. Before a time, they were busy with repair work. Feeding the hungry and caring for the old and weeping for the fallen trees. And there was no time to think about the future. Wise voices calmed our ancestors, telling them not to think of the weather as a metaphor. It was neither a warning nor a curse. It was just the weather. This was the soothing information they wanted. They accepted it. So most of them were looking in the wrong direction and did not notice the moment when the strangenesses arrived to turn everything upside down. Okay, this is day 2 of Wednesdays. On Wednesdays, we are reading some of the Thousand and One Nights, and we're also going to then be reading other works of literature that make allusions to or are greatly influenced by the Thousand and One Nights. So we read the Thousand and One Nights earlier where we left off. We'll pick it up again. And we're also reading that we've now read the second chapter of Salman Rushdie's 2 Years, 8 Months, and 28 Nights, which adds up to 1,000 nights and one night more. So I'll link the original video from last week in the pinned comment of the pinned post, or whatever the heck needs to be done there. And I'll see you next Wednesday for a continuation of this literature get together. We're going to keep reading the Thousand and One Nights, and we will also read other works of literature that are related to the Thousand and One Nights once we're done with Sir Rushdie. So God bless and good night. Oh, and I forgot. On Mondays and Wednesdays, we are doing something new. So on Mondays, we're doing Plato's Symposium. We're reading all of Plato's works. It's a lot of fun. But after that, we're going to do a spaces for people who are watching to come in and grab a mic, point things out that were missed, disagree with things that were said. I'm not doing a lot of lecturing here today, obviously. Um, but we'll talk about stuff, and we're going to do the same thing on Wednesday, which is today. So we'll finish our literature. I will go start a spaces right now and do all of that stuff. So we'll end the stream. Goodbye. God bless. Peace. The next chapter is called The Incoherence of the Philosophers.